So, let's start with the first scene of Act 3. So, in his soliloquy, which we're going to take a closer look at a little bit later in this lesson, Macbeth reveals that his fears in Banquo stick deep. Okay? Now, this is going to foreshadow the murder of Banquo. It's also important for a couple of other reasons. One, it shows that Macbeth's character is continuing to change, right? He's going from more virtuous and loyal, a good friend of Banquo's, to more and more isolated and insane and more paranoid, right? The murder has made him paranoid, and someone he used to see as a friend, Banquo, he's now seeing as a threat, right? And he's going to act on that impulse and kill his friend, sadly, in Macbeth. Another reason why it's important, I think, is that he doesn't really definitively share his plan to kill Banquo with his wife. Now, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, they, in a sick way, have a really good relationship, right? In a sense. When they make that plan to kill Duncan, it's very evil what they're doing, and, they're certainly not doing anything commendable, but they communicate very well. They plan together. They seem to have a strong, twisted kind of love for one another. But by this point in the play, Macbeth does not share with his wife definitively his plans to kill Banquo. So we see a little bit of a separation between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Macbeth is isolating himself. He's growing more and more paranoid, and this spells trouble for the new King of Scotland. One thing that's interesting here is Macbeth convinces the murderers that Banquo is their enemy. So Macbeth meets with 2 murderers, though as we're going to talk about, 3 murderers show up to kill Banquo, which is interesting, and scholars have different interpretations of the significance of that discrepancy. But Macbeth is speaking very poorly of his friend to these murderers, and again, it's an indication that his character has changed drastically. He says that Banquo is one who wear our health but sickly in his life. So our here, note Macbeth is using the royal we. Right? We talked in another earlier section that sometimes kings use the first person plural to refer to themselves, and here Macbeth is using it, which in his death were perfect, right? So he's talking about Macbeth in his health is sickly in life, but in his death were perfect. So he's expressing on a surface level that he wants Banquo dead. But it's interesting because, again, he's speaking in paradoxes, right? He's saying that his health is sickly in life. So how can health be sickly, right? Health isn't sickly. And then how can something be sickly in life but perfect in death? Now, of course, what Macbeth is saying is that he wants Banquo dead, that he'll be happy when he's dead. But he's speaking in paradoxes. And again, this is forging a little bit of a link between Macbeth's own language and the paradoxical language used by the witches, most famously in Fair is Foul and Foul is Fair, right? And it's creating a connection between the way Macbeth's behaving, right, in his language, and the way that the witches prophesy that he will behave. So again, the audience is seeing that things are not looking good for Banquo, something terrible is going to happen in Act 3, and things are going to continue to get worse. In Scene 2, again, we see Lady Macbeth alone. And I keep bringing this up because it's important. We have this motif of doubling in Shakespeare's Macbeth. So kind of like in Act 1 when we see Lady Macbeth by herself, and then in Act 2, before Macbeth returns to tell her about the murder, she's alone. And here in Act 3, she's alone. And when we first see her, she's very, very strong. She says, "The raven is hoarse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements." Basically, I'm going to kill the king. The second time, she's starting to show a little bit of a softer side, is my interpretation. She says, if she didn't resemble my father, I would have killed him. So it shows a little bit of kindness or sympathy in her heart. And in this third example, where we see her alone for a moment, she's confessing that she kind of regrets the murder of Duncan, right? She says famously, "Naught's had all spent where our desire is got without content." And this kind of summarizes the dilemma of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So naught here means nothing, right? So nothing is had, meaning nothing is gained. they gained nothing through their murder. Everything is spent, right? Where our desire is got, right? Meaning they achieved their goal of becoming king and queen without content. And of course, content means happiness. By the way, the rhyming nature of her language, spent and content, right, means that this counts as a couplet. And when Shakespeare uses a rhyming couplet, which we introduced when we talked briefly about sonnets in an earlier section, when he uses a rhyming couplet, often it draws the reader's attention through the rhyme to what's being said. So this is important. It's not a long speech, but in this short phrase, Lady Macbeth sums up the dilemma that she and her husband face. They murdered the king to get what they wanted, and now that they have what they want, they're not happy at all. Macbeth similarly says, and this is one of my favorite short lines from Macbeth, he says, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife." Right? Again, sometimes in Shakespeare, it's not just the long speeches that have a lot of meaning. It's short clips of language that are sometimes the most powerful. And I think this is another great example. So, first of all, we have an example of inverted syntax. Right? Normally, we would say, my mind, that's my subject, is my verb, and then full of scorpions is kind of the predicate here. So my mind is full of scorpions, but he's inverting it here. But this image is really powerful. The scorpion, of course, is the creature that's common to deserts. It's very poisonous. It's kind of a symbol of danger. So the idea that his mind is filled with scorpions crawling around and injecting venom into his brain, it really shows that Macbeth is losing his mind, that he's tortured by guilt and by paranoia, and that we're really seeing a marked shift in Macbeth's behavior. And he's saying this openly and honestly because he's alone with his wife. Okay, so both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are beginning to regret what they've done, and it's a little bit ironic because what's going on around them? The banquet, the coronation ceremony. This is an event that should be one of the happiest days of their lives. All the nobles from Scotland have gathered to recognize them as king and queen. This should be one of the happiest days of their lives. But instead, Macbeth's mind is full of scorpions, and Lady Macbeth feels like naught's had and all spent. A second moment that I think is important and warrants further analysis in this second scene of Act 3 is when Lady Macbeth says, "What's to be done?" And her husband replies, "Be innocent of the knowledge." Now, when they talk about this, what they're referring to is Macbeth's plan to murder Banquo. Right? So again, we mentioned this earlier. When Macbeth and Lady Macbeth choose to murder Duncan, they're really communicating with one another. They're very honest, and in a sense, they're a form of support for one another. But by Act 3, their crime is making them more and more isolated. And so when Lady Macbeth says, "What's to be done? You're worried about Banquo. What are you going to do?" He says, "Be innocent of the knowledge." Meaning, I don't want to tell you what I'm going to do. But of course, we learn that he kills Banquo, right? Which is really the climax of the play and the beginning of that falling action and the beginning of the long tragic downfall in this play. Again, this is kind of an instance of doubling because earlier in Act 2, Macbeth distances himself from Banquo, right? He pretends that he doesn't think of the three witches. And now he's distancing himself from his wife. He's pretending, that he wants to keep her innocent and not telling her about Banquo's murder, but we can't help but ask, does he no longer trust his wife either? Right? It's an important question to ask, I think. Scene 3 takes place outside the palace at Forres, where Fleance is with his father Banquo on horseback prior to the banquet celebrating the coronation of Macbeth and his new queen, Lady Macbeth. So, one of the interesting things here is that the murderers arrive to kill Banquo and Fleance, but a third murderer shows up. Now, we know that Macbeth has ordered 2 murderers in an earlier scene to kill Banquo and his son, but a third murderer shows up. Now, one takeaway from this fact is that Macbeth is becoming more paranoid. he doesn't trust the two murderers that he's hired to kill Banquo and Fleance to get the job done. So a third murderer shows up. He hires another murderer. Some scholars have even asked, is this third murderer Macbeth himself? Does he not trust the murderers to get the job done, so does he try to do it himself? I think regardless of whether the answer to this question is yes, and really we can't tell, we don't know for sure, we definitively can say that Macbeth is becoming more paranoid and more erratic in his behavior. He's changing his plans. He's more and more nervous that he's going to be found out and caught. Another important line in this scene occurs when the third murderer says, "There's but one down, the son is fled." So, but here means only, and the one that's down is Banquo. Banquo is killed, but the son, Fleance, is fled. And again, this scene of a murder is kind of a double of what happens earlier when Macbeth and Lady Macbeth kill Duncan. Now, when they kill Duncan, they accomplish it successfully, right? It's not the perfect crime, in a sense, because, for example, Macbeth almost forgets to leave the daggers on the bodies of the guards. But ultimately, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth pull it off, as evidenced by the fact that they're now King and Queen of Scotland. But this murder is a failure. Okay, so again, we're seeing things start to slip away from Macbeth. And this moment really marks the climax of the play. Because when Macbeth finds out that Fleance is gone, he becomes more and more obsessed with the idea that Fleance will go on to found a line of kings, and therefore Macbeth's own children won't continue to maintain the crown of Scotland. And therefore Macbeth will have jumped the life to come, gone to hell, and made himself an evil person, and spoiled his happiness, and gone insane, without even being able to pass down the crown to future generations. Okay, and remember, historically, who would Shakespeare's audience have thought Fleance to be a relative of? They would have thought that Fleance was the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of James I, the English king, in attendance when the play was first performed. Scene 4 of Act 3 marks the climax of Shakespeare's Macbeth, according to the reading that I'm advancing in our course, and according to the reading that I think many scholars are going to advance. And this counts as the climax because we really see events unfolding and changes in Macbeth's character that bring him eventually towards his tragic downfall. And this is the point of no return, right? He's beginning to lose his mind and to commit deeds that are so dark that there's no turning back. There's no way for him to maintain his role as king. We can see that inevitably it's going to end in death and he's going to be overthrown. Okay? So, the first moment, I think, that we've already taken a look at, but that I want to situate in context here, is when Macbeth learns that Fleance has escaped, he reacts using a metaphor. He says, through an aside, I'll add, meaning he says it to the audience, but other characters don't hear. He says, "There the grown serpent lies." The grown serpent here is Banquo. The worm that's fled, the worm is his son, Fleance. Hath nature that in time will venom breed. So meaning, Banquo is dead, but Fleance lives. Eventually Fleance will grow up and seek revenge. And this is important because this is evidence of Macbeth's paranoia growing. It's also an indication that the final part of the first prophecy is becoming true. The stage is set for Fleance to found a line of kings. And it's also important, again, because we know that the descendant of Fleance, according to tradition, is James I in Shakespeare's historical audience. And next, I think another important point that shows that Macbeth is detaching himself from reality is that when he sees the ghost of Banquo before him, right, he sees this new hallucination, which, by the way, he doesn't question like his old hallucination. He knows that he needs to hide it from his guests, right? Otherwise, they'll know that he's guilty of killing Banquo. So he gives a very lame excuse. He says, "I have a strange infirmity," which means sickness, "which is nothing to those who know me." So he and Lady Macbeth try to pass off his hallucination as a sickness. And they try to pass it off as something that those who know him, meaning his friends and his family, are aware that he sees these visions and that it's nothing to worry about. But imagine that you're one of the Scottish noblemen or noblewoman. Are you going to buy this excuse? Probably not. You're going to hear the king saying this and you're going to think, the new king is crazy. And the fact that he's talking about the death of this guy Banquo and the fact that the old king died at his house is pretty clear evidence to me that there's something wrong with this king, and maybe he's responsible for the death of Duncan. Scene 5, we return to another scene where the witches are alone. And this scene is significant for 2 reasons. First of all, we have another witch, really the goddess of witchcraft, Hecate, introduced into this scene. Secondly, there's another instance of doubling. Let's take a look. So, first of all, as we see, we have the goddess of witchcraft entering into the scene, and she's chiding or scolding the other witches for not involving her in Macbeth's fate previously, right? And this is interesting because in Act 1, Scene 1, we see the witches meeting amongst themselves and planning what they're going to do to Macbeth. And then it's not until Act 1, Scene 3 that Macbeth arrives a little bit later. Similarly, in Act 3, Scene 5, we see the witches planning amongst themselves for how they were going to interact with Macbeth later on in the play. And a little bit later in our course, we're going to analyze the scene where the witches meet with Macbeth and issue to him the second set of prophecies, a very crucial point in Shakespeare's Macbeth. But here, what's a little bit interesting is that Hecate says she foreshadows what's going to happen later when Macbeth meets the witches for the second prophecy. Right? Everything she says here predicts what's going to happen. She says that she's going to conjure artificial sprites. Sprites are spirits. And indeed, Macbeth is going to see apparitions or visions during the second prophecy. The fact that these are artificial suggests that they are trying to trick or fool Macbeth, and indeed, they do seem to be working a really terrible kind of mischief as they mislead him. She says, by the strength of their illusion, they will cause Macbeth to spurn fate, scorn death, and bear his hopes above wisdom, grace, and fear. And indeed, this is exactly what's going to happen. They're going to give Macbeth 2 prophecies that he's going to misinterpret. The first prophecy is the prophecy of Birnam Wood, which we've already talked about. They say that not till Birnam Wood moves to Dunsinane will Macbeth fall in battle. And they say that no man of woman born will harm Macbeth. However, they also are going to tell him to beware Macduff. So, what she's really foreshadowing is going to happen is that these spirits are going to cause Macbeth to be overconfident. And he's going to spurn his fate, which means he's going to reject his fate. He's not going to pay attention to how his fate is unfolding. He's going to scorn death. Scorn, again, means to reject overconfidently. So he's going to think that it's impossible for him to die based off of these misleading prophecies. And he's going to bear his hopes above wisdom, grace, and fear, meaning his hopes, his ambitions, and his belief in these prophecies, due to the mischief of Hecate and the goddesses in the scene, or Hecate and the witches in the scene, are going to cause him to be too confident in the prophecies and to ignore the immediate danger that's in front of him upon his tragic conclusion. Scene 6 is important, as we've kind of already mentioned, and again, it's an example of this doubling and this recurring event, because again, we have Scottish noblemen commenting on recent events. And really, the Scottish noblemen, when they have these kind of conversations in Shakespeare's Macbeth, they're kind of playing the role of the chorus, right? So the chorus in ancient Greek drama, and indeed in some of Shakespeare's drama, is a group of people who kind of represent the community, and they speak together to show how the community is interpreting the events that are unfolding on stage. Okay, and so the Scottish noblemen have these conversations, and the audience, we take cues from them as to how different people are interpreting Macbeth's rise to power and his looming downfall, and the extent to which they trust Macbeth as the rightful king of Scotland, and the extent to which they suspect that he, through treachery and regicide, has secured the Scottish throne. Okay, so here in this scene, Lennox talks with an unnamed lord, and the lord says, the son of Duncan, from whom this tyrant holds the due of birth, is at the court of the English king, awaiting military support. So we learn two things here. First of all, Malcolm is seeking the support of the English king. By the way, remember, the King of Scotland has just assumed the throne of England. So recently, in Shakespeare's time, James I has kind of unified and showed an alliance between Scotland and England, right, in the formation of Great Britain. Well, we see that hinted at here a little bit too, because the English king here is helping the Scottish royal family, okay? But what I think is significant here is two important things. First of all, Macbeth is described as a tyrant. A tyrant is an evil ruler. So the fact that the Lord, right, the unnamed nobleman, calls Macbeth a tyrant shows that the Scottish nobility is turning against Macbeth, which helps to foreshadow what is to come in Act 5. The second thing that's important is that we learn that Malcolm is gaining allies in England, and we can get a sense that Malcolm is trying to raise an army and to overthrow Macbeth, and indeed that is what's going to happen in the final act of Shakespeare's Macbeth.